Next, we're going to explore the whole notion of sustainability. What does it really mean? And who gets to claim that they're one of the good guys? Healthy, natural, organic, fresh, local. You get the idea. So please welcome Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund and Seth Goldman, the man who runs Honest Tea, who notably goes by TEO as opposed to CEO, and the CEO of Wholesome Wave is Michel Nischan. And now I turn it back to Mary Louise Kelly.
I'm going to step up this way. Hello again. All right, welcome. Well, as Margaret said, we're focusing this next conversation on sustainability, which is a tricky one because just the word can mean something very different to a chef, to a restaurateur, to a big global corporation, to a parent trying to get dinner on the table. What there does seem to be broad agreement on is that it's a challenge and that it's urgent, that the planet's resources are finite, that the number of people on this planet is growing, and that we are all hungry. So with that, let me start with you, Michel, and ask whether there was an aha moment for you. And you've probably had several, wearing your many hats as a chef and a restaurateur and entrepreneur and food writer, but can you point to one where it clicked for you? I've got to not only produce food that tastes really good, but in a way that's good for the planet as well.
Yeah, so I think my big aha moment was when my son Chris was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 5. That's over 20 years ago. And I was doing kind of like the local sustainable organic thing as a chef because both my parents were farmers, and that's where I felt that the better flavors and the better quality were, and there was also a value in that kind of farming culture that was happening with that type of production that seemed to be going by the wayside, and the fact that those are real small businesses and that create good jobs. The environmental and the human health impact happened when I learned that what we did with Chris's food would have more to do with the success of his long-term outcome than anything else, and that was my big aha moment. And but it was a kind of like an aha 18-month to 2-year period of diving into all of the potential research that was out there and available at the time, and really came to some what I feel are very firm conclusions about what food humans in general should be eating, how much of what has a lot to do with not just diabetes, but all health conditions that are impacted by
well, give us the headlines.
Food choices.
What
so,
are
yeah,
the
heart disease, high blood pressure, many forms of cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity, et cetera. So osteoporosis even. So it's like you look at those things and say, oh my goodness gracious, one of the biggest drivers in all of those diseases is the food that we eat. And when you look at each of those diseases separately, the way that people should be eating to avoid them, it's almost an identical diet. So it's that was a big aha moment for me, and that my conclusion was I can't feed my customers what I won't feed my son.
Right.
So I started changing the way that I do business.
Well, I was just going to ask. I mean, I assume y'all were already eating pretty well in your house, given your profession. What did you actually change?
Well, so you know, a lot of people assume that, but when you are a chef, and back in the day when I was making my way, local, organic, sustainable actually was very unpopular. So I wasn't one of those really popular chefs that was able to have multiple restaurants that were firing on all cylinders, so I could spend time at home with my family. So the truth was I was doing the 14 and 50-hour days, feeding everybody else in their family, and my wife was left at home with the kids, also working a part-time job and having to struggle with all this. So they were eating things like white bread for their sandwiches, and when I learned that highly processed carbohydrates in white bread are identical to just feeding your child sugar, that white bread wasn't a good idea, but making the change from white bread to crunchy, whole grain, really awesome bread was a really difficult thing to get my children to do. So I learned that it's actually like a 3-year journey. You have to go from white to tan to a little bit of a darker tan to a brown. So we went through things as a family that helped inform the way I was speaking to my consumers and my customers about the struggles that they were going through as well, and also how to moderate and modify your business plan as you move along and bring other people on the journey. That you can't just pick up a sword and a shield and start yelling at people and swinging the sword and bantering the shield. That it's really a conversation and a journey. Yeah, you got to bring people on. Yeah.
Seth, you talk about a moment in your journey, your aha moment. You were jogging in Central Park.
Right.
What happened?
So I was working with Calvert Group, the mutual fund company up the street. They have a portfolio where they do socially responsible investing, and I was enjoying it, but I always had that entrepreneurial itch. I was just waiting for the right idea. And I went and gave a presentation to some institutional investors in New York City, and after that went for a run in Central Park with an old teammate from the cross-country team in college. After the run, we go to a beverage cooler, and I say, "There's nothing here." He says, "What do you mean? There's hundreds of options."
This is one of these like pretzel carts.
Yeah, no, just at a bodega. And I said, "There's tons of options, but they must all have the same calorie profile. They must all have the same ingredient profile. The difference is colors and fizz or not, or bottle shape. There's nothing here with, everything's either got 100 calories or 0 calories. Why isn't there something with 1 teaspoon or 2 teaspoons of sugar per 8-ounce serving?" And I realized this was sort of an idea I could get excited about. I had no beverage experience, but I was thirsty, and I figured that was a pretty good qualification. So I got in touch with my business school professor, who, when I was at the Yale School of Management, we had studied the beverage industry, and we had agreed there was something missing. And he had just come back from India, and he had come up with the name Honest Tea. And that just kind of, parted the clouds for me that, okay, this is how to take this idea of a product connected to a brand and a purpose.
And you literally started brewing.
Yeah, I started brewing tea in our kitchen, and eventually I left my job at Calvert, brewed 5 thermoses of tea, and got an empty Snapple bottle that we pasted a label on.
Do you still pay royalties?
No, I think. No, yeah. And so brought it to the Whole Foods buying office in Rockville, Maryland, and said, "We want to sell this in your stores." And to my great delight and simultaneous horror, the buyer said, "Great, we'll take 15,000 bottles."
Oh, wow.
And so,
that's a whole lot of Snapple you got to buy and fill the label off of. And Jason Clay, you have an image that you've evoked when you talk about the whole sustainability issue that keeps sticking in my head. You have argued the average cat in Europe has a larger environmental footprint than an African person. First of all, strictly scientific, peer-reviewed research on this for the
as good
cat's
as we
footprint?
can get.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But I mean, the broader point is we've got real issues going forward. The resources are finite. How do you see this?
Well, I think many of us think about sustainability in terms of our own lives or our communities or the farm we buy from or the store we buy from. But increasingly, we live on a planet where food is global. Food systems are global. And we're not managing the planet. We're selectively taking things from it. And I would say we've got to start defining sustainability in terms of planetary boundaries. Why is somebody from World Wildlife Fund here talking to you about food? I mean, it seems like a real stretch. And it's because we came to realize that the biggest threat to biodiversity, the biggest threat to ecosystem services globally right now, forget 2 billion more people, 2.9 times per capita income over today, forget doubling consumption. Just today, food production, where and how, is the biggest threat to the planet. Going forward, it's going to become bigger. So how do we do more with less? How do we reduce the footprint of food? And just to put that in perspective, in terms of land, water, fertilizer, pesticides, just those inputs, to be where we are today by 2050, we have to reduce how each product is produced by 62%. If we want to get back to a single planet, it's going to be closer to 75%. So we really have to start measuring what matters. And that's not just one thing. We can't just measure greenhouse gases. We can't just measure water. We can't just measure soil erosion. We've got to measure all those things. Not 1,000 things, but not one. So we've got to figure out how to optimize solutions across 2 or 3 or 4 key variables.
I'm curious, sorry, what percent of that is animal-based consumption? I mean, just, when you look at the proportions of the impact.
Of the impact? Well, so right now, in terms of the planet, how much land we use for beef, for food, about 60% is used to produce beef. and that's about 1.3% of calories. It's maybe 2.5, 3, maybe even 4% of nutrients.
Wow.
Now the question isn't do we not eat beef? And the land that's used to produce beef, 90% of beef globally is fed grass. It's not fed grain. It's not the kind of feedlot system that we have in this country. But the real question is, can we use 30% of the land to produce twice or 3 times as many of those calories and nutrients? We've got to get better. Water's the same thing. We use 1 liter of water to make 1 calorie of food today. So the average diet of 2,000, 2,500 calories is 2,000, 2,500 liters of water. Can we double the amount of productivity with half the amount of water? We've got to start measuring what matters and then managing it.
And when we talk about managing it, to telescope us back a little bit, we have this central challenge. There's a lot of people to feed. There are going to be more people to feed. Resources are finite. If we look at the factors that are going to drive this change, it's interesting to me because you 3 seem to come at this from somewhat different perspectives. I know, and I want to hear in a second from you, Jason, you're focused on how you get big corporations to drive change and then bring consumers along with them. Michel, from what I gather, you're more focused on the ability of consumer, of individuals, of eaters, let's call us, especially low-income consumers in terms of driving change, and it goes up and we tell the companies what we want and then they're going to produce it for us. Talk a little bit about how you see it.
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. I think what's interesting, and I think all 3 of us would agree on the panel that what a consumer chooses and what chooses to consume has a lot to do with everything that we're talking about. With the low-income consumers, part of it originally was actually driven by just good old-fashioned guilt. When I did Heartbeat Restaurant in 1997 as a reaction to what I learned about Chris's diet, a local organic sustainable restaurant in Manhattan that used no processed food of any kind. We didn't use butter, we didn't use cream, we didn't use flour, sugar, anything like that. I could afford to do that because my customer could afford to spend $50 for an entree. And when I actually started learning about the truth about type 2 diabetes, which affects tens of millions of Americans, and that the majority of the people that struggle from it can actually be prevented through food, reversed in the early stages through food, long-term catastrophic effects like amputations and organ failure could be mitigated through food, but then the majority of people that suffer from type 2 diabetes or prediabetes don't have an income that allows them to make the food choices that can prevent the disease. That's where I hit the wall. And what was interesting was I took the same journey many people did. I thought it was really actually about lack of education and lack of knowledge about healthier food choices. It didn't take me long to discover once I decided these are communities that I really wanted to connect with and figure out a way to help there be a better future, was that it really was lack of affordability, that period. A lot of people talk about access. Access is completely meaningless without affordability. There's just a study that came out that was publicized in one of the big papers about how just putting grocery stores in underserved communities doesn't equal healthier food choices. And then you do the math of 50 million Americans that rely on some kind of federal food assistance. 21 million of them are decision makers who actually buy the food.
Right.
And they spend $80 billion just in SNAP, another $10 billion in WIC, and then a matching dollar of their own. So you're looking at a $180 billion retail food marketplace. Obama won his election by a landslide of 2,000 votes. This is 21 million Americans who spend $180 billion and don't even go to the polls.
And so you've pushed for things like, can you use your food stamps at a farmer's market instead of
or can you
buying Cool Whip?
And we had to work in farmers markets because they were friendly to us, because there weren't the marketing ploys there, and there wasn't the threat of a potential grocery manufacturer's lawsuit against the USDA to provide an unfair trade advantage in a retail setting. But we were able to prove the concept that if you simply just say, spend your food stamp on whatever you want to spend it on, but if you come over here and you spend it on fresh fruits and vegetables, we double your money, that notion of the 2-for-1 value translates across all languages, all ethnicities. Everybody understands a 2-for-1 sale. And the interesting thing that we've unlocked that I don't think a lot of people were aware of is that you provide affordability, people will aggressively self-educate. So that whole thing of not knowing what to do with broccoli becomes a lot less of a barrier when someone can actually afford to buy the broccoli.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I totally take your point, from the restaurant level, for example, it's relatively easy to cook beautiful, organic, free trade food if somebody can pay $50 for their main course. Mm-hmm. I guess my question is, when we hear a lot about changes happening at like the fast food level, McDonald's says they're going to transition to cage-free eggs. Chipotle is transitioning to antibiotic-free meat. And I guess my question is, what drives that? And how do we continue to leverage that to continue to drive it? Is that consumers begging for cage-free eggs, or is it pressure coming from government and other forces? Seth, you're not.
So our exciting news this year is Honest Tea just launched in all of the Wendy's restaurants around the country.
6,000
Wendy's restaurants. You're selling
Wow.
organic, fair trade, lightly sweetened
That's
tea.
pretty cool.
It's really neat. And then our kids, for Honest, we have a drink called Honest Kids, organic, lower calorie drink pouches. Those are in all the kids' meals. And we also just launched with Chick-fil-A, the same product. And so this is a big deal. This is, we talk about trying to democratize organics and getting it in the hands of, our goal was never to just sell healthy drinks to healthy people. We love healthy people. Everyone should be healthy, but most people aren't, and most don't just encounter it. So someone goes to Wendy's, they're not saying, I want to go buy an organic drink. They're saying, I'm just looking to get some food. And all of a sudden we're there. And it is driven, ultimately it's driven by the consumer. Wendy's wouldn't do it if they didn't think the consumer wanted it. But it was clear, Wendy's sort of looked at, we have two paths. Do we want to end up like in the McDonald's, trajectory? Or would we rather move, toward more where the Chipotle is? And obviously they chose that opportunity. And there's a halo effect from having an organic product. And it was a very funny negotiation with them because first they said, well, we looked at organic, it's certainly higher than our price point. I said, well, the organic does cost more because we're sort of the full cost, the real cost of food as opposed to a subsidized cost. But if you can't pay it, you don't want our brand. I said, okay, well, we'll pay the price. And said, well, now we like a sweeter tea. I said, well, then you don't want our brand. So okay, well, we'll take a less sweet. And so it wasn't much of a negotiation. We just said, this is it, and they took it the way it is.
And if I might, if I can mirror on that, Walmart. One of the first pledges that they made when Partnership for a Healthy America came out was that they wanted to have, by the end of 2015, 15% of all fresh food that they source from their supply chain to come from within 150 miles of their regional redistribution warehouses. I don't know how many folks have been to a Walmart. I have. I get my fishing license there. Bought some patio furniture there once. And I never saw the yuppie aisle. There is no yuppie aisle. Walmart doesn't niche market. It's low prices every day, but they have the largest organic section for a retail food grocer. And when they make a pledge, their focus group information and the market surveys that they do are very proprietary. We're never going to know how they came up with it. But when they make those public statements and when Wendy's makes a move like this, I think it indicates that low-income consumers know a lot more about food and are demanding more from food than most of us give them credit for. I've learned that to be the absolute truth through our work with Wholesome Wave, is that we have wildly discounted the power of the underserved consumer and their ability to make a good choice for their family and what they really truly want. So I think it's great news because there is this broad market movement that a lot of folks just aren't aware of.
And just on a practical level, if your drink is more expensive than serving whatever the alternative was, a soda with that, does the meal become a little bit more expensive? Is Wendy's absorbing that?
So the tea is more expensive than the rest of the beverage offerings, but that's a conscious choice. The Honest Kids is line price, so you can choose soda, Honest Kids, or milk, or water.
So it's kind of a market mix thing. That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Do you, we should, for those who don't know, you sold Honest Tea to Coke a few years ago. You remain the TEO, as was mentioned. Do you have a TOO as well? How far down the chain? But this is a forgive me, but a weird business model. This organic, fair trade, healthy food, that you have sold to what to many people is like the pinnacle of corporate, sugary, bad for you evil. Did people, when you were doing that negotiation, did people look at you and say,
Yeah, they raised a few eyebrows, no
you're
question.
going to lose your soul?
I said, well, keep an eye on us. Let me know if you see any instance where we back down from our mission. And in fact, in every dimension, I would say we've deepened it. So now everything we sell is organic. When Coke invested, about 30% of our business was fair trade certified of our tea. Now all of our teas are fair trade certified. Just this year, because we shifted to a new bottle that, because of Coke's purchasing, saves us 2 cents, we spent an extra penny, and all of our sugar is now fair trade certified. So that means we're not only paying, it's inorganic, so we're paying a premium back to these communities to reinvest in schools and healthcare. And then under calories, we only had 2 zero-calorie drinks when Coke invested. Now we have 13. So from my point of view, every dimension of our mission has gotten not just deeper, but more powerful. And we look at our reach. We were in 15,000 stores before Coke invested, mostly on the coast, mostly health food, natural channel. Now we're in over 100,000. We bought 800,000 pounds of organic ingredients before Coke invested. This year we bought over 6.7 million pounds, and just the Wendy's business alone will demand 1.1 million pounds of organic ingredients. So now when I go to these growing communities, it's not just some guy from Bethesda saying, oh, I like organic and fair trade. It's someone from the Coca-Cola company saying, this is a key part of our growth and our future. And if you want to be our partner, we won't even look at your samples unless it's organic and fair trade certified.
This kind of speaks to points I know that you have made. You have the leverage of Coke behind you. You can get a lot done.
So our strategy is a bit different. And I think it's kind of both ends pushing the middle, as it were. But we start from the premise that change is happening very fast today on the planet. The speed of life is extremely fast, and we have to make transformational changes at that same speed. Changing the minds of 7 billion plus consumers is just not going to get us there. So we're basically taking the position that consumers shouldn't have a choice about sustainable products, that all the products on the shelf ought to be sustainable, and that it's up to companies to source the raw materials that are produced more sustainably, put them as ingredients, and make all their offerings, make their brand stand for sustainability. And companies are beginning to do that. We're working with 70 of the 100 largest food companies that touch about 25% of all 15 of the most traded global commodities that have key impacts on the planet. That's a way to really leverage change more quickly. We're not saying that consumers shouldn't be educated, but today I would say one of the biggest obstacles that we have around this issue of more with less and living within the boundaries of the planet is that we have 7.4 billion food experts. And they don't agree on anything. And they're not using the same science. And food is extremely cultural. How people make choices is going to vary a lot. How they're informed ought to be the same. You can have, as one person said, you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own science. We've got to figure out how to inform a discussion, create a conversation, and move this forward more quickly.
What is your pitch to these companies when you come in and say, we're the World Wildlife Fund, everything has got to be sustainable? And they're saying, yeah, and we're responsible to shareholders and making a profit.
Right. So you start with what you're big to and what's big to you. You start with the 5 commodities that represent 50% of your buy or 50% of your volume of purchase. And then you go to 10, and then you go to 15. Some companies have done 1 or 2 and then gone all in. So Unilever has made a commitment around 3,300 raw materials that by 2020 they'll all be certified as sustainable. A lot of other companies like Mars, et cetera, have focused on 15 or 20 commodities that represent 70 to 80% of their purchase. So we're seeing a lot of movement in this space that's just faster than one by one or one consumer choice at a time. You take the average consumer in the US, when they go into a grocery store, it's seconds that they use to make a choice. Now in Europe, it may be seconds plus 50%. So instead of 2.9 seconds, it's 3.5. You can't even read the ingredients, much less understand where they came from, what the latest science is, and triangulate all that and make an informed choice. So everything on the shelf needs to be sustainable. That's what we've got to get to. And frankly, consumers are consumers. They're people. I think we need a lot more knowledge in this space because of how people vote, not just because of what they buy.
And I'd love to hear y'all's responses, whether you buy this, but when you say everything on the shelf needs to be sustainable, how are you defining that term?
Well, we need global standards for how things are produced and be verified against those standards. That to me is kind of the bottom line. It's got to be science-based. We can't focus on 100 things. Let's focus on the key 6 or 8 impacts that the raw materials, the production of those raw materials has, and let's reduce those. Let's measurably reduce those. The other little thing that we've noticed, and this is where I think many of us who talk about private sector approaches and companies and products and things get kind of miss the boat a bit, is that we're all focusing on what the better producers are doing and what the better consumers are doing, et cetera. But the reason we care about certain commodities, whether it's palm oil or soy or beef or whatever, is because of the impacts. And the impacts are not primarily from the better producers, they're from the worst producers.
Seth?
The bottom 25% produce 50% of the impacts and 10% of the product. If you want more productivity and less environmental impact, you focus on the bottom. Companies are not going to be able to do that as much as governments. So we've got to get governments back in the equation here. We've got to get governments to begin to look at what are the employment that's being lost? What's the exports that are being lost? What are the environmental damage that we have to pay for as citizens? What's all that coming from these poorer producers to get the government to push the bottom?
Seth and Michel, do you buy this? This sounds like a kind of revolutionary idea to take the choice away from the consumer, give it to the corporations.
Or actually,
and governments?
They've done it.
Yeah, I think a great model to me is the USDA organic seals, because it doesn't take the choice away from the consumer, but it's an aspirational certification. So, one of the challenges when we partner with a large company is how do we maintain our ability to protect our mission? And so having a third-party verified standard is so important, because otherwise you could just, like any big company, we could say anything, and consumers in general aren't going to believe you because they don't, they have good reason not to believe large corporate America. So you create a third-party standard that is objective, that has definitions. It's not our own science. It's not our own version of organic. It's a federally enforced seal, globally enforced, in fact. And then the same with fair trade, a definition that is backed up, and then we can hold it out to consumers, and if consumers get enough education, they seek it out, and there is a market incentive for it. So while I certainly appreciate the argument, I'm not as sure a government can impose standards, but if the governments can create more objective, positive incentives in the marketplace, that to me is a good model.
Yeah. I think, the theory is fantastic, but it's just turning the switch on or off is an impossibility. And when we look at the things that actually make it possible for those kind of like bottom 20% to have so much negative impact, a lot of it has to do with just artificial price support through the form of some kind of subsidy, tax credit, tax incentive. These companies are not paying the same land costs, and they're not paying for the externalities that they're creating, and that it's like actually starting with some of the worst practices and just making them illegal would be a really great thing. It's like you could send somebody to jail for dumping copious amounts of mercury into the Amazon.
But it's funny you
very
mention
quick
that.
response, then we're going to take questions.
Because in fact, The Atlantic a few months ago published a one-pager that we've been working on independently for about the last 3 years, and I was taken aback to see this. But basically it said that, I think the thrust was 10% of global food is fraud. So that 50% of the I believe was the figure. 50% of the olive oil sold in the U.S. is not even olive oil.
Right.
And there's all kinds of dilution and substitution, and
it's huge.
red snapper that's not snapper. It's actually tilapia that's methane treated so that it turns red. I mean, there's so when you say make it illegal, it's already illegal. It's just not enforced.
Right.
We're finding that 5 to 50% of all globally traded food items that we've looked into are not produced legally in the country of origin. So getting legal is a good step.
Good. All right, questions? Let's open it up. We've got a microphone making their way around. I see one here, and then we'll come over here. Oh, one there first, and we'll come to you.
First to the mic. I'm Megan Stas. I'm with the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Thanks for this. I think you guys touched on this a little bit, but it's in these food conversations, it's so easy for us to get into these polarized discussions, right? Us versus them, conventional versus organic, big versus small. But I think it's really obvious that we all have a role to play here. So can you talk more about the importance of scale and size and efficiency and sort of the positive impact that big companies, medium-sized companies can have in some of these global food challenges?
Yeah, I think on immediate scale, when you look at manufactured product, reformulation is a massive opportunity. When we look at the amount of highly processed carbohydrate, polymers, and all of the things that are in things that make it possible for somebody to have macaroni and cheese in a minute and 30 seconds, being able to change a lot of those things that have absolute deleterious impacts on human health when those are the only calories that you can afford to consume would go a long way, I think. That's just top line quick answer to that one question. That reformulation, I think, can go a long way.
Let me pitch
within the power of those companies.
The scale issue slightly differently. India and China, between 40 and 50% of global consumption. That's scale. It's not just companies, it's where consumption is going to happen going forward.
Question right here.
Hi, thank you. Dan Enoch from AgriPulse. Just curious as to what your definitions of sustainability are. Jeff, I thought you kind of ducked the question. Your answer was, we need global standards on how they are produced. But there's just such a wide variety of ideas about what sustainability is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'll go first. So, to me, the definition of sustain is to uphold life. What's interesting is that the definition of consume is to devour and destroy. And so if you are committed to sustainability in a consumer economy, you're automatically living in that contradiction. And I think, our challenge is to try to do as best we can to sort of reconcile that contradiction and do what we can to uphold life. So, for us, obviously, organic is a key piece of that.
Okay.
So I think there's that it's the three-legged stool. Producers need to be viable, but economic viability doesn't necessarily mean sustainability, but without it, it's certainly not sustainable. Social, you have to have a living wage, and that includes farmers. Most malnutrition, most stunting today on the planet is farmer families. So most farmers are not actually producing enough to make their families viable, so they're not sustainable in any kind of sense. On the environmental side, it's been defined as many different things. I would say, at least on the land side as opposed to the seafood, the probably single best criteria would be soil carbon. If you're going to measure one thing, but I think input use efficiency is another way to think about it. Water use, pesticide use, fertilizer use. Soil erosion is actually a measure of soil carbon because you're measuring that. But I think we can't afford to focus on just one thing, and we can't focus on too many things. So we've got to find that sweet spot, and reasonable people may disagree about this, but building consensus around this issue would really let us start to measure, and not just on a farm, but at a landscape level, at a country, at a planetary level.
It's a great question, because I think you're hitting on that there is no globally agreed definition. We're all trying to move kind of in a similar direction.
An ugly question is the role that shareholders play in our food system, because
shareholders meaning
shareholders in large companies, and the money that they take right off the top in dividends and returns and the expected returns that they drive. Often those returns are possible only in cutting cost of goods and cost of labor. We're not seeing those investments lead to the types of innovations that are resulting in less water usage, for instance. You're basically dropping your cost of goods and your cost of labor so you can continue to guarantee that return, so that you can expand the product footprint, so that you can put more product into the market. That's where the investment money is going. So it's not going into the things that we're talking about. So there's a role there in that Wall Street expectation from the food system. And because it's so critical to human environmental health, should it be looked at? Should there be a different expectation there?
So hand raised back here.
I'd be interested in just how do we, you talked a little bit about having integrity in science. How do we sustain the chair of a high integrity food chain and science at the table? I think Dr. Clay said it, we can all have our own opinions, but we can't make up science. I think one of the concerns we see is an actual decrease in the dollars being spent on innovation to solve these bigger problems. So how do we keep that at the table and realize and look at facts like, hey, organic takes right now about 30% more resources than some of the other traditional systems. We can close that gap with innovation. I'm sure of that. The question is the time and the pace and the speed that Dr. Clay's talking about, can we do it fast enough? Mm-hmm. And how do we bring, science is not a chair at all the tables it probably needs to be. So how do we create that dialogue to increase investment to keep up with the pace of what's going on?
It's a big question. Who wants to tackle it?
Well, it's interesting. We're a science-based organization, but you often come up against issues where public opinion and science need to be introduced to each other because they're pretty far apart. I think a recent example is with eggs, where the largest, most complete, thorough scientific investigation was done looking at 3 different systems of egg laying, from individual cage to cages of multiple birds to open barn. And they were not just around that variable. They also look at worker health and safety, product quality, death rates, feed conversion, ammonia, all kinds of things. And what came out very clearly in that study, which is published, it's online last March, you can find it, was that the open barn system was the poorest performer. And yet that's what consumers want. They want free range. And yet it's somewhere in the middle that you probably get optimal performance around all these things. So if we're going to have a science discussion, let's have that science discussion and let's put that stuff on the table. I think what we've lost is the ability to have conversations in the middle. It's being driven by extremes. And we've got to take back the middle to have these kind of conversations. The planet depends on it at some level, because these are not black and white issues. These are gray, and they're trade-offs. And we've got to understand what those trade-offs are. And people will have different opinions about those trade-offs. That's fine. But let's at least start with what the data is telling us. And science is going to change. There's no question about that. But let's not just ignore the science.
Let me bring us toward a close by raising something that we haven't gotten to, which is you often hear referred to as the farm to table to landfill problem, that we can have all the sustainably grown, organic, healthy, locally sourced food you want. It doesn't do you much good if it's getting thrown away. And there are different statistics on this, but something like 40% of the food that gets produced in America ends up going straight into a landfill. Michel, how big a challenge is that, and how do you think about that? In your restaurant, in your food writing.
Well, I think it's a significant challenge, and a lot of it is driven by, I think, convenience and this disconnect of what the real cost of food is. But to me, when we look at mass end users in the system and the way that food gets moved around, there's a missing piece, I think, in value add. A lot of people talk about the lack of slaughter facilities and animal processing facilities to allow a variety of different size producers to be able to have equal access to a market. Fruit and vegetable farmers largely, so I'm going to focus on that because we're mostly in the fruit and vegetable business. Most of them are they're in a price-taking position,
right?
And their margins are so slim that when they look at a field and they can really only get 40 to 60% of it to market because of standards imposed by what produce should look like by the grocery industry, et cetera, or upscale restaurants won't take anything but a perfectly round apple. It's cheaper for them to just turn it into compost or leave it rot in the fields and just drive a disker over it than it is to get it to market. So there isn't a market for those field run seconds. So when we look at the incredible pressure, for instance, to change and put better quality into our school food system, I think that's a value-added play. I look at ugly misshapen eggplants and tomatoes and potatoes and blemished field onions as the ingredients to a really awesome oven-roasted vegetable lasagna that could be put into tray packs that can be slid into hotel pans, 30 hotel pans topped with breadcrumbs, put in an oven, and now you can feed 1,000 students oven-roasted vegetable lasagna. There are supply chain opportunities for different types of manufacturing that can create jobs. A lot of people think it's putting brand new kitchens in schools and hiring more cafeteria workers. The facility actually might be a 500,000 square foot facility that can service a 3-state region and take those field run seconds and put them into the oven roasted vegetable lasagna that can meet the current infrastructure and skill level that exists. You're still creating jobs, but it's actually a business that can be invested in, can be financed, can be pay back a return. I see food waste. We have to look at it as a business opportunity if we're going to start to chip away and solve some of it.
Thank you. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Michel, Nischan, thank you.
Welcome.
Seth, Goldman, Jason, Clay, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Whatever.